My parents claimed my sister would be uncomfortable if I joined the family vacation to Hawaii. They'd been planning for 6 months, saying she needed space to heal after her divorce. I stood in their living room, holding the flight confirmation email I'd received 3 weeks ago, watching my mother's face flush as she stammered through her explanation. My father wouldn't even look at me. Behind them, through the kitchen doorway, I could see my sister Morgan scrolling through her phone, smirking. She glanced up just long enough to meet my eyes, and I saw it. That familiar glint of satisfaction she'd had since we were children. The one that appeared whenever she successfully convinced our parents I was the problem. This time, though, she'd made a miscalculation. This time, I had something she didn't know about. The room felt suffocating as Mom continued her rehearsed speech about Morgan's fragile emotional state and how my presence would create unnecessary stress. I watched my father finally raise his eyes, expecting to see me cry or argue like I had so many times before. Instead, I smiled. I picked up my purse from their couch, pulled out a small envelope, and placed it carefully on their coffee table. "I understand completely," I said, my voice steady and warm. "Morgan needs you both right now. I hope you all have a wonderful time." The confusion on their faces was delicious. Mom reached for the envelope, but I was already walking toward the door. "Don't open that until you're at the airport," I called over my shoulder. "Consider it my vacation gift to the family." I'm a cardiac surgeon at Seattle Presbyterian, the hospital where my father had triple bypass surgery 2 years ago, and where Morgan's ex-husband still works as an anesthesiologist. I'd spent 6 years putting myself through medical school, while Morgan was failing out of her 3rd college attempt, funded entirely by our parents who believed her constant stories about learning disabilities and unfair professors. I'd paid for their mortgage twice when Dad's accounting firm nearly went under, never asking for repayment. I'd covered Morgan's wedding costs when she blew through her budget, and 3 months ago, I'd been the one Morgan's husband confided in about why their marriage was really ending. He'd found the messages, all of them, and he'd sent me copies before filing for divorce, thinking I should know what kind of person my sister really was. I'd been sitting on that information like a patient spider, waiting for the perfect moment. As I drove away from my parents' house that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from my colleague in Hawaii, the one who worked at the resort where my family had booked their stay. Everything was ready. The next morning, I went to work like any other Tuesday. I performed a routine valve replacement, consulted on 2 post-op patients, and had lunch with Dr. Patricia Kingsley, the chief of surgery. She mentioned she'd finally finished reviewing the ethics complaint that had been filed 6 weeks ago, the one about a nurse who'd been falsifying patient records and stealing medication. "We're moving forward with criminal charges," Patricia said, shaking her head. "The evidence is overwhelming. The police will be involved by tomorrow." I nodded sympathetically, thinking about how Morgan had been working as a medical records clerk at this very hospital for the past year, a job I'd helped her get when she couldn't keep any other position. How she'd been complaining about money troubles despite living in our parents' guest house rent-free. How I'd noticed certain inconsistencies in medication logs 3 months ago, but had waited, documented everything quietly, and submitted the anonymous complaint only after she'd excluded me from the Hawaii trip. My phone rang at 2 p.m. It was my mother, calling from the Honolulu airport. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. And again. Finally, I answered on the 5th attempt. "Rebecca." Her voice was shaking. "What is this? What did you give us?" I could hear the chaos in the background. Dad's voice, sharp and angry. Morgan crying. "I told you not to open it until you got to the airport, Mom. Did you read everything?" The envelope had contained printed screenshots. Morgan and her best friend laughing about how easy it was to manipulate the parentals. Morgan admitting she'd lied about her divorce, that she'd actually been caught having an affair with a married doctor at the hospital where I worked. Morgan's detailed plan to get me excluded from the Hawaii trip because she'd invited her affair partner instead, someone our parents had never met. And the final screenshot, Morgan telling her friend that she'd been the one to drain Dad's business account 5 years ago, letting everyone blame his partner because she'd needed money for her cocaine habit. "Where did you get these?" Mom's voice was barely a whisper now. "Are you sure they're real?" I watched my reflection in my office window, 30 stories above Seattle, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "They're real, Mom. Every single one. I've had them verified by a digital forensics expert, His report is in that envelope too. And Mom, you should know that Morgan's about to have a very difficult time finding employment. Turns out she's been stealing from the hospital where she works. The police are getting involved tomorrow. I'm sure it's just a coincidence that she suddenly needs space to heal in Hawaii right now. The line went silent except for Morgan sobbing in the background. Then I heard her voice, shrill and desperate. Let me talk to her. Rebecca, please, you don't understand. But my father had apparently taken the phone. Rebecca Louise Hartwell. His voice had that tone he'd used when I was a child and had disappointed him. This is vindictive and cruel. Your sister is going through a difficult time. My sister, I interrupted, my voice ice cold, is a liar, a thief, and a drug addict who has manipulated all of you for nearly 3 decades. And I'm done being the family scapegoat while you enable her. I paused, letting that sink in. Oh, and Dad? You might want to check with your homeowner's insurance. I'm fairly certain Morgan's been listing your address as her primary residence to maintain coverage on that car you co-signed for, the one she totaled last month while driving under the influence. The accident report will be filed with the state by Friday. Your premiums should be interesting. I could hear my mother crying now. Good. Let them feel a fraction of what I'd felt every time they'd chosen Morgan over me. Enjoy Hawaii, I said. I hear the weather is beautiful this time of year. Try not to let family drama ruin your vacation. I ended the call and blocked all their numbers. The next 3 days were a symphony of destruction that I conducted from my office and operating room, never missing a beat of my actual responsibilities. Wednesday morning, the hospital security escorted Morgan from the building in handcuffs. By noon, it was all over the hospital gossip chain. How she'd been stealing opioids and selling them. How she'd been altering patient records to cover her tracks. How she'd involved her affair partner who was now also under investigation. I made sure to look appropriately shocked when my colleagues told me, even though I'd been the one to ensure every piece of evidence was documented and filed correctly. That afternoon, my father's business received notice that their insurance company was launching an investigation into potential fraud, triggered by the discrepancies in Morgan's vehicle registration. Thursday, my mother left me a voicemail, her voice small and broken, admitting they'd cut the Hawaii trip short. Morgan was facing criminal charges. The affair partner had been suspended. Their perfect family vacation had turned into a nightmare of police calls and lawyer consultations from a hotel room 12 hours from home. Friday evening, I received an email from my father's business partner, the one who'd been blamed for the missing money years ago. He'd seen the news about Morgan's arrest, and certain things were starting to make sense to him. He was considering legal action. I replied with a carefully worded message of support, attaching nothing directly incriminating but suggesting he might want to review the timeline of when that money went missing versus when Morgan had suddenly paid off her credit cards. I added that I'd be happy to provide testimony if needed, as I'd witnessed some interesting conversations back then that I'd been too young to understand at the time. By Sunday, my phone had 47 missed calls from my family. I deleted them all without listening. My parents had chosen Morgan over me for the last time. They'd excluded me from a family vacation, something so petty and cruel that it had finally broken whatever remaining loyalty I'd clung to. Now they could live with the consequences of enabling a monster. Monday morning brought the most satisfying development. Morgan's ex-husband filed an addendum to their divorce proceedings, including evidence of her theft and drug use. He was seeking full custody of their daughter and demanding repayment of marital assets she'd squandered. My parents, who'd promised to testify on Morgan's behalf, were now listed as potential witnesses about her drug use and unstable behavior. I'd made sure certain photographs from family gatherings made their way to his lawyer. Photographs where Morgan looked notably impaired. Photographs our parents had dismissed as just having fun. Doctor, Patricia Kingsley called me into her office that afternoon. Rebecca, I heard about your sister. I'm so sorry you're dealing with this family situation. I nodded graciously. Thank you, Patricia. It's been difficult, but I believe in letting the justice system work. My sister made her choices. Patricia leaned forward, her expression sympathetic. I want you to know this won't reflect on you professionally. Everyone here knows you're beyond reproach. I smiled, thinking about how I'd carefully constructed every step to ensure exactly that outcome. I appreciate that. I just hope my sister gets the help she needs. But I didn't hope that at all. Tuesday morning, I was scrubbing in for a complex aortic repair when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I ignored it through the 6-hour surgery, focused entirely on the intricate work of saving a 53-year-old teacher's life. When I finally checked my messages during post-op rounds, I found it was from my Aunt Helen, my mother's sister who lived in Portland. Your mother called me sobbing. What happened in Hawaii? She won't give me details but says you've destroyed the family. Call me. I deleted the message. Aunt Helen had always favored Morgan too, had been the one to lend her money that was never repaid, had made excuses for every failure. By Wednesday, the text messages from extended family members started flooding in. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions about my cruel behavior. My uncle demanded I do the right thing and help Morgan. I blocked each number methodically, feeling nothing but contempt for people who'd never once asked my side of any story. The hospital grapevine brought me updates I didn't even have to seek out. Morgan's affair partner, Dr. Richard Castellano, had been terminated. His wife, a prominent attorney, had filed for divorce and was apparently seeking to destroy him financially. The nurses whispered about how he'd been sleeping with multiple staff members, how Morgan had just been the latest in a long line of poor decisions. I made sure to look appropriately disgusted during these conversations, never revealing that I'd been the one to send his wife an anonymous package containing hotel receipts, text messages, and photographs that Morgan had foolishly stored on the hospital's shared drive. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to my office. My father appeared during my lunch break, looking like he'd aged a decade in 1 week. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. Security had called ahead, asking if I wanted him removed. I'd said no, curious about what desperate move he'd attempt now. Rebecca. He stood in my doorway, his hands shaking slightly. We need to talk about your sister. I gestured to the chair across from my desk but didn't put down my salad. I'm listening. He sat heavily, seeming to struggle with where to begin. The charges against her are serious. She could go to prison. Your mother is having a breakdown. This is tearing our family apart. I took a bite of my salad, chewed slowly, swallowed. Morgan tore this family apart years ago, Dad. I just made sure everyone could finally see it. His face flushed red. You set her up. You engineered this whole thing. That ethics complaint, that was you, wasn't it? I met his eyes steadily. I reported illegal activity I witnessed at my place of employment. That's called being a responsible professional. What would you have had me do? Cover up theft and drug abuse? He slammed his hand on my desk, making my water glass jump. She's your sister. You were supposed to protect her. The laugh that came out of me was sharp and bitter. Protect her? The way you and Mom protected me when she convinced you I was stealing from your wallet in high school? When she told everyone I was bulimic to explain why her cocaine money went missing? When she slept with my boyfriend in college and you told me to forgive her because she was going through a hard time? Dad's face went pale. We didn't know. You didn't want to know, I corrected. There's a difference. And now you're here because Morgan's finally facing consequences. And you want me to what? Lie to the police? Recant my statement? Fund her legal defense? He leaned forward desperately. Rebecca, please. She's still your sister. Family is supposed to forgive. I set down my fork carefully. Family is also supposed to include you in vacation plans. Family is supposed to believe you. Family is supposed to love you without conditions. You taught me that family means nothing when it's convenient to exclude someone. I learned that lesson well. Dad's voice cracked. Your mother can't sleep. She can't eat. She keeps saying she failed both of you. Something cold and hard settled in my chest. She did fail both of you. She failed Morgan by never holding her accountable, turning her into a criminal, and she failed me by never believing I was worth protecting. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to a specific folder I'd been maintaining for years. Do you want to know how long I've been documenting Morgan's lies, Dad? Since I was 16. Every time she blamed me for something she did. Every time you chose her word over mine. Every time I paid for her mistakes. I turned the phone around, showing him years of screenshots, saved voicemails, forwarded emails. I have documentation going back 13 years. Every single time. His hands were shaking harder now. "What do you want from us, Rebecca? What will it take for you to help her?" I stood up, signaling the conversation was over. "I don't want anything from you anymore. That's the point. I spent my entire life wanting you to see me, to value me, to choose me just once. You never did. So I stopped wanting it. I built a life where I don't need you, where your opinion doesn't matter, where your choices can't hurt me anymore." I walked to my office door and opened it. Morgan's consequences are her own. She stole drugs. She falsified records. She put patients at risk. She committed crimes. That has nothing to do with me and everything to do with who she chose to be. Dad stood slowly, looking broken. "She's asking for you. She wants to apologize." The rage that flashed through me was white-hot and cleansing. "Tell Morgan that I'll visit her in prison. I'll bring pictures of my life, my successful career, my beautiful home, my peace of mind. And I'll let her see exactly what she could have had if she'd spent half as much energy on being a decent person as she did on destroying me." He left without another word, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I watched him shuffle toward the elevator, this man who'd once been my hero and felt nothing but relief that his power over me had finally died. Friday afternoon brought a call from Morgan's public defender. She couldn't afford a private attorney now that our parents had to disclose the extent of their financial problems. The lawyer, a tired-sounding woman named Ms. Patterson, asked if I'd be willing to provide a character reference for sentencing. "Your sister seems to think you have information that would help her case." I almost laughed. "I have extensive information about my sister's character, Ms. Patterson. None of it would help her case. I documented her theft, her drug abuse, and her pattern of manipulation for years before reporting it. If I'm called to testify, I'll do so honestly and completely." There was a long pause. "Ms. Hartwell, your sister is facing 8 to 12 years in prison." Then my sister should have thought about that before she committed 8 to 12 years worth of crimes. The lawyer's voice hardened. "You understand that your testimony could be the difference between prison and a treatment program?" I looked out my office window at the Seattle skyline, at the city I'd conquered through sheer determination while my sister had been busy destroying lives. "Ms. Patterson, my sister's addiction didn't make her steal from patients. Her entitlement did. Her addiction didn't make her falsify records. Her lack of conscience did. And her choices didn't happen in a vacuum. She was enabled by parents who never held her accountable, and a sister who cleaned up her messes until I finally stopped." I could hear papers shuffling on the other end. "So that's a no on the character reference?" "That's a no on lying under oath to save someone who spent 30 years making me the villain in her story. Morgan made her choices. Now she gets to live with them." Saturday morning, I went for my usual 10-mile run through the Arboretum, stopped at my favorite coffee shop, and spent the afternoon performing volunteer surgery at the free clinic I'd been supporting for 3 years. My colleagues there knew nothing about my family drama. To them, I was just Dr. Hartwell, the talented cardiac surgeon who donated her time to help underserved patients. That evening, I had dinner with my boyfriend Marcus, a civil rights attorney I'd been dating for 8 months. I hadn't told him much about my family situation, just that we were estranged. Over wine and pasta at our favorite Italian restaurant, he mentioned he'd taken on a new case. Medical malpractice suit against Seattle Presbyterian. Patient died after receiving incorrect medication dosages. The records were falsified to cover it up. My heart rate didn't even spike. That's terrible. When did it happen? 4 months ago. We're still building the case, but it looks like there was a systematic pattern of record falsification in the cardiac unit. I knew exactly which case he meant. I'd been the one to first notice the discrepancy, the one whose anonymous tip had started the internal investigation that ultimately exposed Morgan's theft ring. A 67-year-old grandmother had died because Morgan had altered medication records to hide her theft, creating a cascade of errors that ended a life. I'd made sure that evidence was preserved, documented, and filed correctly. Now her family would get justice, and Morgan would face additional charges. "I hope you win," I told Marcus sincerely. "People who put patients at risk for personal gain deserve everything that comes to them." He squeezed my hand. "One of the defendants is named Morgan Hartwell. Any relation?" I met his eyes without flinching. "My sister, We're not close. His expression shifted to shock, then sympathy. God, Rebecca, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to refer the case to someone else? I shook my head. No. That family deserves the best representation they can get. Don't let my connection to the defendant compromise their case. Marcus studied my face carefully. You knew about this, didn't you? About what your sister was doing? I took a sip of wine, considering my answer. I suspected. I documented. I reported. And I made sure the evidence was ironclad before anyone could destroy it or sweep it under the rug. He leaned back, reassessing me. That's why you're not upset about this case. You're the one who made sure it could be prosecuted. I smiled slightly. Morgan spent our entire lives making me pay for her mistakes. I decided it was time she paid for her own. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. There's something you should know. The prosecution is building a case that could result in manslaughter charges. If convicted, your sister could face 25 years. The number settled over me like a warm blanket. 25 years. Morgan would be 53 when she got out. Her daughter would be grown. Her youth would be gone. Her opportunities would be destroyed. And she would have decades to think about how she'd destroyed herself. Good, I said simply. Marcus's eyes widened. Good? Rebecca, that's your sister. I set down my wine glass with deliberate precision. Marcus, let me tell you about my sister. When I was 14, she told our parents I was pregnant to cover up her own abortion. When I was 17, she stole my college fund to buy drugs and convinced them I'd spent it on a car. When I was 22, she slept with my boyfriend and then told everyone I was crazy for being upset because it just happened. When I was 26, she stole prescription pads from the hospital and forged my signature, almost costing me my medical license. I picked up my wine again, my hand perfectly steady. And 3 weeks ago, she orchestrated my exclusion from a family vacation because she wanted to bring her married lover, the same vacation I'd partially funded. So yes, good. Good that she's finally facing consequences. Good that a family who lost their grandmother will get justice. Good that she can't hurt anyone else for 25 years. Marcus reached across the table, taking my hand. I see why you're at peace with this. But Rebecca, are you sure you won't regret it later? The finality of it? I thought about that question seriously, examining my feelings with the same clinical precision I used in the operating room. Was there any part of me that would mourn Morgan's destruction? Any fragment of sisterly love that would resurface as guilt? I searched my heart and found it empty of anything but satisfaction. The sister I might have loved never existed, Marcus. She was always a fiction I created to justify the abuse. The real Morgan is finally visible to everyone, and the real Morgan deserves everything that's coming. He nodded slowly. Then I'll make sure that family gets every penny they're owed and that your sister never practices in any medical facility again. I raised my wine glass in a toast. To justice. He clinked his glass against mine, but his expression was troubled, like he was seeing a side of me he hadn't known existed. Sunday evening, my mother showed up at my apartment building. The doorman called up, asking if I wanted her sent away. I told him to let her up, curious about what final plea she'd attempt. When I opened my door, I barely recognized her. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her hair was unwashed, her face bare of makeup, dark circles under her eyes making her look like a ghost. Rebecca. Her voice was hoarse. Please, 5 minutes. I stepped aside, letting her into my pristine apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furnishings, all paid for by my own success. She looked around like she'd entered a stranger's home. I didn't offer her a seat. Your 5 minutes started when you walked in. Mom's face crumpled. How can you be so cold? So cruel? This isn't the daughter I raised. The laugh that burst out of me was sharp and painful. You didn't raise me, Mom. You raised Morgan. I raised myself while you cleaned up her messes and made excuses for her crimes. She took a shuddering breath. We made mistakes. We know that now. But what you've done, destroying your own sister, that's unforgivable. I walked to my bar cart and poured myself a scotch, not offering her anything. What I've done is stand by while Morgan destroyed herself. Every consequence she's facing is from her own actions. I just refuse to cover for her anymore. Mom's hands twisted together desperately. She's talking about suicide, Rebecca. She can't handle being in jail. She's falling apart. I took a slow sip of scotch, letting the burn ground me. Then she should have thought about that before she killed Mrs. Patricia Donovan by falsifying medication records. Did you know about that patient, Mom? The grandmother who died because Morgan was too high to do her job correctly? The color drained from my mother's face. That was an accident. Morgan meant to steal drugs. Morgan meant to falsify records. Morgan meant to cover her tracks. That a patient died was just a consequence she didn't think about because she's never had to think about consequences. Mom stumbled to my couch and sat without permission, her face buried in her hands. What do you want me to say? That we were wrong? That we should have believed you? Fine. We were wrong. We should have believed you. Now please, help us. Help your sister. I finished my scotch and set the glass down with a decisive click. You want to know what would have changed this, Mom? If 3 weeks ago, when Morgan suggested excluding me from Hawaii, you had said no. If you had said, Rebecca is our daughter too, and we're not leaving her behind. If just once, just one single time, you had chosen me. Tears were streaming down her face now. We didn't understand. Morgan said you'd been mean to her, that you'd been resentful about her divorce. And you believed her, like you always do, like you always will. That's the problem. I walked to my door and opened it. Your 5 minutes are up. I have an early surgery tomorrow. She stood slowly, looking at me with something between horror and disbelief. You're really going to let your sister go to prison for 25 years? You're going to testify against her? I met her eyes without wavering. I'm going to tell the truth under oath. If that sends Morgan to prison for 25 years, then Morgan committed 25 years' worth of crimes. The math isn't complicated. Mom's voice dropped to a whisper. I'll never forgive you for this. Something final and irrevocable settled in my chest. Good. That makes us even. I'll never forgive you for 30 years of choosing her over me. Now get out of my home. She walked past me like a zombie, and I closed the door behind her with a soft, final click. I poured myself another scotch and stood at my window, looking out at the city lights below, and felt nothing but peace. The war was over. I had won, and I had no intention of ever looking back. Monday morning brought unexpected complications wrapped in a manila envelope delivered to my office. Inside were printed social media posts, screenshots from a Facebook group called Seattle Medical Community, where someone named Justice for Morgan had been posting for the past 48 hours. The posts painted me as a vindictive sister who'd orchestrated an elaborate revenge plot, twisting facts just enough to make me look suspicious without being outright libelous. My nurse practitioner, Linda, had brought me the envelope with a worried expression. Dr. Hartwell, patients are asking about this. Some are requesting different surgeons. I flipped through the pages, recognizing my mother's writing style in the emotional appeals, Morgan's manipulation in the carefully chosen details. They'd included my full name, my hospital, even my medical school graduation photo. The comments section was filling with outraged strangers demanding I be investigated. I called the hospital's legal department immediately. Jonathan Pierce, our chief counsel, met me in his office within 20 minutes. This is defamation, he said after reviewing the posts. We can get a cease and desist issued today. I shook my head. No, I want to do something better. I pulled out my phone and opened a folder I'd been maintaining since medical school. These are documented instances of Morgan's theft, drug use, and manipulation going back 15 years. I have police reports, hospital incident reports, witness statements, and her own text messages admitting to crimes. I looked up at Jonathan. I want to file a formal complaint for harassment and defamation. I want discovery to force them to prove their claims. And I want every piece of evidence I've collected entered into the public record. His eyebrows rose. That's nuclear, Rebecca. It'll destroy what's left of your family relationships. There's nothing left to destroy, I replied calmly. They started a public campaign to damage my reputation and career. I'm going to finish it by showing exactly who Morgan really is. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying me with newfound respect. This will get very ugly very fast. I smiled. Good. I've spent 30 years playing nice while Morgan played dirty. Time to show her what happens when someone fights back with facts instead of manipulation. By Tuesday afternoon, our cease and desist had been served, and I'd filed a comprehensive defamation suit seeking $2 million in damages, not because I needed the money, but because I knew my parents would have to liquidate everything to defend it. The Justice for Morgan post disappeared within hours, but the damage was done. Local news had picked up the story of sisters in legal battle over hospital theft case. I granted exactly one interview to a journalist I knew who specialized in medical ethics. The article ran Thursday morning, front page of the Seattle Times. Whistleblower doctor faces family backlash after exposing sister's criminal activity. The reporter had done her homework, interviewing my colleagues, reviewing public records, and presenting a timeline that made Morgan look like exactly what she was: a career criminal enabled by parents who'd sacrificed everything, including their other daughter, to protect her. The article mentioned that I'd taken no joy in reporting my sister, but had prioritized patient safety over family loyalty. It quoted the family of Mrs. Patricia Donovan thanking me for my courage, and it included a statement from the hospital praising my integrity and professional ethics. By Friday, my phone was ringing with interview requests from national media. I declined them all except one. 60 Minutes wanted to do a segment on medical professionals who blow the whistle on family members. I agreed, with one condition. They had to interview Mrs. Donovan's family and show the human cost of Morgan's crimes. That same Friday, I received a call from an unexpected source. Morgan's ex-husband, David. We'd always gotten along during their marriage, one of the few people in Morgan's life who'd seen through her performance. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something." His voice was tight with suppressed anger. "Morgan's lawyer contacted me. They want me to testify that you had a grudge against Morgan, that you were jealous of her, that this is all revenge for her marrying me." I felt ice in my veins. "I dated you for 3 months in college before you ever met Morgan. We broke up amicably. There's no grudge." David's laugh was bitter. "I know that. You know that, but Morgan's spinning a story about how you never got over me, how you've been sabotaging her happiness for years. She's trying to make this about a love triangle from a decade ago." I closed my eyes, marveling at Morgan's ability to create fiction. "What did you tell her lawyer?" "I told them to go to hell," David said firmly. "And then I called my own lawyer and had her draft a statement for the prosecution. I'm testifying about Morgan's drug use during our marriage, the times she stole from my wallet, the nights she disappeared and came home high. I'm bringing bank statements showing how she drained our savings. I'm bringing everything." Relief flooded through me. "David, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he interrupted. "Morgan destroyed our marriage. She put our daughter at risk. She's trying to destroy you now because you're the only one who ever stood up to her. I'm done enabling her by staying silent." After we hung up, I sat in my office feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not satisfaction or vindication, but genuine gratitude that someone else had finally seen the truth. That evening, I received a registered letter at my apartment. Inside was a handwritten note from my father, his normally steady handwriting shaky and uneven. "Rebecca, you've won. Are you happy now? Your mother had a nervous breakdown yesterday and is hospitalized. Our savings are gone. Lawyers for Morgan. Lawyers to defend against your lawsuit. I've had to take out a second mortgage. Your sister is suicidal in jail. Our family is destroyed. I hope whatever you've gained was worth the cost." I read it twice, waiting to feel something. Guilt, regret, anything. Instead, I felt that same cold satisfaction that had been growing since the day they excluded me from Hawaii. I took a photo of the letter and forwarded it to my lawyer with a note. "Add emotional manipulation to the harassment complaint." Then I poured myself a glass of wine, ordered sushi, and spent the evening reviewing surgical notes for Monday's procedures. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Dinner tomorrow? Need to discuss the Donovan case." I replied with a yes and returned to my notes, unbothered by my father's attempts to weaponize my mother's breakdown. Saturday brought an unwelcome surprise. My Aunt Helen showed up at the hospital during my shift, somehow talking her way past security by claiming to be a patient. She cornered me outside the surgical wing, her face red with fury. "You heartless monster. Do you know what you've done to your mother?" I kept my voice professional and cold. "I know exactly what I've done. I've stopped protecting Morgan from consequences. What happens to Mom is her own doing." Aunt Helen grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to leave marks. "She tried to kill herself last night, Rebecca. She took a bottle of pills. If your father hadn't found her..." I pulled my arm free, my voice dropping to deadly quiet. "Don't you dare put that on me. Mom's choices are her own. If she can't handle finally seeing Morgan clearly, that's 30 years of denial catching up with her. Not my responsibility." Helen's face twisted with disgust. "What happened to you? You used to be kind, gentle. Now you're just cruel." I straightened my spine, meeting her eyes with zero warmth. "I learned from the best. Morgan's been cruel our entire lives, and everyone rewarded her for it. I'm just refusing to be her victim anymore." I stepped around her, heading toward the surgical prep area. "Now get out of my hospital before I call security." She called after me, her voice echoing down the hallway. "You'll regret this someday, Rebecca. When you're old and alone, you'll realize family is all that matters." I didn't turn around, didn't respond, just kept walking. Let her think whatever she wanted. I had surgeries to perform, patients to save, a life to live that had nothing to do with the toxic waste dump my family had become. Sunday afternoon, I finally watched the 60-minute segment that had aired the night before. They'd done exactly what I'd asked. Centered Mrs. Donovan's family, showed photos of the vibrant grandmother who'd been stolen from them by Morgan's negligence and greed. They interviewed her son, who broke down describing how his mother had been healthy, recovering well from routine surgery, until suddenly she wasn't. The medical expert they brought in explained how medication record falsification had created a cascade of errors, how Morgan's theft had directly resulted in this woman's death. Then they showed Morgan's mugshot, her arrest record, the evidence of her crimes. And finally, they interviewed me. I'd been careful with my words, keeping my tone professional and measured. This wasn't about revenge or family drama. This was about a pattern of criminal behavior that put patients at risk. When I discovered what was happening, I had a professional and ethical obligation to report it. That she happened to be my sister doesn't change that obligation. The interviewer had pressed me, "But you must have felt conflicted, knowing your report would destroy your sister's life?" I'd looked directly into the camera, my expression neutral. I felt conflicted about the patients who'd been put at risk. I felt conflicted about the families who didn't know their loved ones had been endangered. I felt conflicted about the system that had failed to catch this sooner. What I didn't feel conflicted about was doing my job. The segment ended with Mrs. Donovan's family thanking me by name, calling me a hero for prioritizing patients over family loyalty. Social media exploded overnight. Half the comments praised me for my integrity. The other half called me a heartless sister who should have handled it privately. I read neither side. Public opinion didn't matter. What mattered was that the truth was out there, documented and indisputable. Monday morning brought the validation I'd been waiting for. The hospital board called an emergency meeting and I was asked to attend. I walked into that conference room expecting reprimand or at least uncomfortable questions about the media attention. Instead, Dr. Patricia Kingsley stood and began clapping. One by one, the entire board joined her, a standing ovation that lasted nearly a minute. "Dr. Hartwell," Patricia said once they'd sat down, "we owe you an apology. You flagged concerns about record irregularities 3 months before making your formal complaint. You tried to handle this through proper channels. We should have investigated immediately." She slid a folder across the table to me. "We've completed a comprehensive audit of every case Morgan Hartwell touched during her employment here. We found 47 instances of falsified records, 12 cases of medication theft, and 3 other patients who experienced adverse events that may have been prevented if records had been accurate." The number hit me like a physical blow. 3 other patients, 3 other families who'd potentially lost loved ones, or watched them suffer because of Morgan's crimes. We're notifying all affected families and their attorneys, Patricia continued. We're also implementing new oversight protocols and mandatory dual verification systems. And we're establishing a whistleblower protection program in your name, the Hartwell Protocol, to ensure that staff feel safe reporting concerns about colleagues. I looked around the table at these powerful people who were praising me for destroying my sister. Should I feel proud? Guilty? Something? I felt only that cold satisfaction again, that sense of rightness that came from watching a cancer finally cut out of healthy tissue. Thank you, I said simply. I just want to make sure this never happens again. As I left that meeting, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You're going to pay for this. I promise you'll pay. I screenshot it, forwarded it to both my lawyer and the police, and blocked the number. Morgan's threats were as empty as her conscience. That evening, Marcus took me to dinner at the most expensive restaurant in Seattle. Over champagne and oysters, he told me the Donovan family's lawsuit had expanded. We've identified 8 other families whose loved ones were affected by your sister's record falsification. We're building a class action suit. The hospital will probably settle for north of $20 million. I raised my champagne glass. Good. Those families deserve compensation. Marcus studied me carefully. Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. His tone made me set down my glass. Okay. He leaned forward, his voice low. How long have you been planning this? Because the more I dig into the evidence trail, the more I see your fingerprints everywhere. You didn't just report Morgan. You documented everything, preserved evidence, made sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. This wasn't a spontaneous whistleblowing. This was a calculated takedown. I met his eyes steadily, considering how much truth to reveal. 3 years, I finally said. I've been documenting for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. And the right moment was when they excluded you from a vacation? I smiled slightly. The right moment was when I finally stopped caring if they loved me. Once I didn't need their approval anymore, I was free to do what should have been done years ago. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. That's sociopathic, Rebecca. You do realize that? I considered his words carefully. Is it sociopathic to remove a tumor? To excise diseased tissue? Morgan is a cancer that's been poisoning everything around her for decades. I just finally had the training and tools to cut her out cleanly. He reached across the table, taking my hand. I'm not judging you. I'm just trying to understand you. Because the woman I'm looking at right now, she's brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. Good, I replied. Terrifying means people will think twice before trying to hurt me again. We finished dinner talking about other things, his cases, my surgeries, plans for an upcoming weekend trip to wine country. But I could feel him reassessing me, trying to decide if what he'd uncovered was admirable or disturbing. I didn't particularly care which conclusion he reached. I'd stopped needing people's approval the day I accepted my family would never give it. Tuesday brought news that Morgan's bail had been revoked after she'd violated the terms by contacting me through proxy accounts, sending those threatening messages. She was back in jail awaiting trial, and my lawyer informed me that the prosecution was now pursuing additional charges of witness intimidation. Each new charge added potential years to her sentence. Each new consequence brought me closer to the complete and total victory I'd been methodically constructing. Wednesday afternoon, I was approached by a literary agent who'd seen the 60 Minutes segment. Your story would make an incredible book, she said over coffee at my favorite cafe. Medical professional torn between family and ethics, choosing to do the right thing despite personal cost. It's compelling. I shook my head immediately. I'm not interested in profiting from this situation. The agent, a sharp woman named Diane, leaned forward eagerly. Then donate the proceeds to patient safety organizations. But Rebecca, your story could change policy, could inspire other healthcare workers to speak up, could save lives. I thought about that, about using Morgan's destruction to create something meaningful, about turning her crimes into a platform for real change. I'll think about it, I said finally, but I won't write anything until after the trial. And I won't soften anything to make my family look better. Diane smiled. That's exactly why it'll be powerful. Real accountability is so rare. As I walked back to the hospital that afternoon, I reflected on how thoroughly my life had transformed in 3 weeks. I'd gone from being the family scapegoat to being publicly praised for integrity. I'd gone from swallowing injustice to serving it cold and precisely measured. I'd gone from being invisible to being seen. Maybe not by my family, but by people whose opinions actually mattered. My phone rang as I entered the hospital lobby. It was David, Morgan's ex-husband. "Rebecca, I need to warn you about something. Morgan's lawyer is trying a new tack. They're claiming you have a personality disorder, that you've been systematically manipulating events to frame Morgan." I felt a spike of fury, quickly controlled. "On what basis?" David's voice was grim. "They're hiring a forensic psychiatrist to evaluate your social media, your documented evidence collection, your testimony. They're building a narrative that you're the real villain." I stopped walking, standing perfectly still in the hospital lobby while people flowed around me. "Let them try," I said quietly. "I've been evaluated by the hospital's psychiatric team as part of my employment screening. I have yearly mental health assessments on file. My psychological fitness is documented and clean." I started walking again, my heels clicking decisively against the marble floor. More importantly, I have evidence. Cold, hard, indisputable evidence of every crime Morgan committed. You can't psychoanalyze away video footage, police reports, and 47 falsified patient records. David exhaled slowly. "You're right. I just thought you should know what's coming." After we hung up, I called Jonathan Pierce in legal. "They're going to attack my mental health," I told him. "We need to be proactive." Within an hour, Jonathan had arranged for an independent psychiatric evaluation, one that would be entered into evidence before Morgan's team could try their character assassination. Thursday brought the evaluation. 3 hours with Dr. Stephen Blackwood, one of the most respected forensic psychiatrists in the region. He asked me about my childhood, my relationship with Morgan, my decision to report her crimes, my feelings about the consequences. I answered every question honestly, holding nothing back. At the end, he closed his notebook and looked at me with clinical assessment. "Ms. Hartwell, you're one of the most emotionally compartmentalized people I've ever evaluated. You've essentially performed surgery on your own family, cutting away diseased relationships with precision and zero anesthesia." I met his gaze calmly. "Is that pathological?" He considered the question. "That depends on whether the relationships were actually diseased or whether you merely perceived them that way. From everything you've told me and everything I've reviewed in the case files, your assessment appears accurate. Your sister is a clinical narcissist with antisocial tendencies. Your parents enabled her consistently. You were scapegoated and abused." He paused. "Your response was logical, methodical, and entirely sane. Ruthless, certainly. But ruthlessness in the service of justice and self-preservation isn't pathology. It's survival." His report, filed the next day, would become crucial to my defense against Morgan's team. It stated clearly that I showed no signs of personality disorder, no evidence of revenge-motivated behavior, no psychological abnormalities beyond adaptive emotional compartmentalization consistent with childhood trauma. It concluded that my actions were the reasonable response of a rational adult protecting both herself and vulnerable patients from a genuinely dangerous individual. Friday afternoon, I got the call I'd been waiting for. The prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Reeves, wanted to meet. I went to her office downtown, riding the elevator up to the 18th floor with my lawyer beside me. Sandra was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that had seen everything. She gestured us to seats and got straight to business. "Dr. Hartwell, your sister's defense is crumbling. We have her dead to rights on the theft, the falsification, the patient deaths. But I need to know something before we proceed." She leaned forward, her gaze penetrating. "Did you engineer this entire situation to destroy your sister? Because if this is just a family vendetta dressed up as whistleblowing, it could compromise the prosecution." I met her stare without wavering. "I reported crimes I witnessed. I documented evidence according to protocol. I prioritized patient safety over family loyalty. My personal feelings about Morgan are irrelevant to the facts of her criminal behavior." Sandra studied me for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you. But I needed to hear you say it. Because the defense is going to paint you as a master manipulator, and the jury needs to believe you were just doing your job. She opened a file on her desk. Morgan's lawyer approached us with a plea deal. She'll plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for 8 years minimum security. My heart started pounding. And? Sandra smiled grimly. I told them absolutely not. We're going to trial, and we're seeking maximum sentences on all counts. With the additional charges for the other patients we've identified, Morgan is looking at 40 to 50 years, if convicted on everything. The number was so much larger than I'd even imagined, 40 to 50 years. Morgan would die in prison. She'd never see her daughter graduate, never get married again, never have another moment of freedom. The magnitude of her destruction would finally equal the magnitude of her crimes. When does the trial start? I asked, my voice steady. Sandra checked her calendar. Jury selection begins in 6 weeks. The trial itself could last 2 to 3 months given the complexity and number of counts. Are you prepared for what's coming? Because it's going to be brutal. I thought about everything I'd already endured, everything I'd already sacrificed. I've been preparing for this my entire life, I told her. I'm ready. The 6 weeks before trial passed in a surreal blur of media attention, legal preparation, and increasingly desperate attempts by my family to make me recant. My father showed up at the hospital twice more, each time looking more haggard, each time begging me to tell the truth about your vendetta. I had him trespassed from hospital property. My mother sent letters, dozens of them, alternating between guilt trips about her hospitalization and thinly veiled threats about what would happen when the truth came out. I forwarded every letter to my lawyer and the prosecutor. Aunt Helen tried to ambush me at my gym, my grocery store, even my favorite coffee shop. I got a restraining order. But it was the call from Morgan's daughter, my 15-year-old niece Emma, that almost broke through my armor. Aunt Rebecca? Her voice was small and scared when I answered, and for a moment I considered hanging up. Please don't hang up. I just need to understand why you hate my mom so much. I closed my eyes, sitting down heavily on my couch. Emma, I don't hate your mother, but she did things that hurt people, and she has to face consequences for that. Emma's voice cracked. But you're the one who told on her. You're the reason she's in jail. Dad says you've been planning this for years. Out of the mouths of children, filtered through David's probably gentle explanation. Your mom stole drugs from sick patients. She changed medical records. A grandmother died because of what your mom did. I kept my voice steady, refusing to let emotion creep in. I reported what I saw because it was the right thing to do, even though it was hard. Emma was crying now. But she's my mom, and now everyone at school knows. They call me the drug dealer's daughter. I don't have any friends anymore. My grandma tried to kill herself. Grandpa lost his business. Everything is falling apart, and it's your fault. The words hit harder than I'd expected. A 15-year-old girl, suffering for her mother's crimes, unable to understand why the aunt she'd once loved had seemingly destroyed her family. Emma, I'm sorry you're going through this. But your mom made choices that hurt people long before I reported her. She hurt me. She hurt patients. She hurt your dad. None of this is your fault, but it's not mine either. Emma's voice turned sharp, an echo of Morgan's manipulation. Everyone says you're jealous, that you never got over Dad, that you always wanted Mom's life. Is that true? I felt ice form in my chest. Morgan had poisoned even her own daughter against me. No, Emma, that's not true. But I understand if that's easier for you to believe than accepting that your mom is capable of terrible things. She hung up on me. I sat staring at my phone, feeling something uncomfortably like guilt for the first time in weeks. Then I reminded myself that Emma's pain was Morgan's fault, not mine. Morgan had chosen drugs over her daughter. Morgan had chosen crime over her family. Morgan had made herself into a person whose downfall would devastate everyone around her. I was just the instrument that finally made it happen. 3 weeks before trial, Marcus and I had our first real fight about the case. We were at his apartment, reviewing discovery documents for the Donovan family lawsuit, when he found something that made him pause. Rebecca, there's a note here in the evidence log. You flagged the Donovan case medication error the same day it happened, not after. the same day. He looked up at me, confusion and something else in his eyes. How did you know to flag it immediately? I felt my carefully constructed walls start to crack. I was reviewing records as part of my normal supervisory duties. I noticed the discrepancy. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, you noticed it within hours of Mrs. Donovan's death, before the official incident report was even filed. That's not normal supervisory review. That's active surveillance. He stood up, pacing his living room. You were watching Morgan specifically, weren't you, waiting for her to make a mistake big enough to be criminal? I met his accusation with cold truth. I was watching everyone in that unit because I'd noticed patterns of medication discrepancies over the previous 3 months. Morgan happened to be the source. When Mrs. Donovan died, I immediately preserved the evidence before it could be altered. Marcus stopped pacing, staring at me. You let that woman die to catch Morgan. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. No, I said firmly. Mrs. Donovan died because Morgan falsified records. I didn't kill her. Morgan did. I just made sure there would be accountability. Marcus's voice dropped. But you suspected what was happening for 3 months. If you'd reported it immediately, Mrs. Donovan might still be alive. The guilt I'd been refusing to feel suddenly threatened to overwhelm me. Had I waited too long? Had I let my need for ironclad evidence delay action that could have saved a life? I forced myself to think clinically. I reported it as soon as I had enough evidence to ensure prosecution. If I'd reported suspicions without proof, Morgan would have destroyed evidence, and nothing would have changed. Marcus sat back down, but there was distance in his eyes now. Rebecca, I love you. But sometimes when I look at you, I see someone who's become exactly what she's fighting against. Calculating, manipulative, willing to sacrifice others to achieve her goals. His words cut deeper than any of Morgan's lies ever had. That's not fair, I said quietly. Everything I've done has been about stopping Morgan from hurting more people. He nodded slowly. I believe that's what you tell yourself. But Rebecca, you're not just stopping Morgan. You're annihilating her. You're destroying everyone connected to her. And you're doing it with a level of precision and satisfaction that honestly scares me. We didn't speak for the rest of the evening. He took me home in silence, and when he kissed me goodbye, it felt like farewell. I walked into my apartment alone and stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at Seattle's lights, and wondered if Marcus was right. Had I become something monstrous in my quest for justice? I poured myself a scotch and pulled out the file I kept locked in my home safe, the one containing every piece of evidence I'd collected over 3 years. Police reports from Morgan's arrests she'd gotten expunged, hospital incident reports that had been lost, witness statements from people she'd intimidated into silence, financial records showing money stolen and never repaid, text messages where she laughed about manipulating our parents, and yes, notes about medication discrepancies I'd observed starting 9 months before Mrs. Donovan's death. 9 months. I'd watched for 9 months, documenting carefully, waiting for the evidence to be bulletproof before reporting. How many patients had been put at risk during that time? How much harm had I allowed to happen by waiting for the perfect moment to strike? I downed my scotch and poured another, Marcus's words echoing in my head. You're becoming exactly what you're fighting against. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since this all started. I made an appointment with my own therapist, Dr. Rachel Summers, whom I'd been seeing on and off since medical school. I sat in her familiar office and laid out everything, holding nothing back. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Rebecca, what you're describing sounds like someone who's systematically dismantled a toxic family system. The question is whether you did it to protect others or to punish those who hurt you. I stared at her. Does the motivation matter if the outcome is the same? Dr. Summers leaned forward. Yes, because if this is about punishment rather than protection, you'll never be satisfied. You'll keep finding reasons to hurt people who've hurt you. You'll become addicted to the vindication. She paused. And I think that's what your boyfriend is seeing. Not someone seeking justice, but someone seeking revenge and calling it righteousness. Her words sat heavy in my chest. Was that what I'd become? Someone so focused on making Morgan pay that I'd lost sight of the actual harm being prevented? Mrs. Donovan died, I said quietly. Even if I'd reported my suspicions earlier, she might have died anyway. The records were already falsified by the time I noticed the pattern. Dr. Summers's expression was gentle but firm. You're rationalizing, Rebecca. You waited because you wanted the case to be airtight. You wanted Morgan destroyed, not just stopped. There's a difference. I felt something crack inside me. She deserves to be destroyed. After everything she did to me, to our family, to patients. Does she? Dr. Summers interrupted. Or does she deserve to face appropriate consequences for her crimes? Because those aren't the same thing. I sat with that question, really sat with it, for the first time since this started. Had I crossed a line somewhere between protecting patients and annihilating my sister? The week before trial, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Sandra Reeves, the prosecutor. She closed my door and sat down with an expression I couldn't read. Dr. Hartwell, I need to ask you something off the record. My stomach tightened. Okay. She pulled out a folder and opened it. I've been reviewing the timeline of your evidence collection. You've been documenting your sister's behavior for 3 years, but the criminal activity we're prosecuting only goes back 18 months. She looked up at me. Why did you wait so long to report? The question I'd been dreading. I wanted to make sure I had enough evidence to ensure conviction. Morgan is persuasive. She's talked her way out of consequences her entire life. I needed the case to be bulletproof. Sandra nodded slowly. That's understandable. But, Dr. Hartwell, if we go to trial and the defense proves you've been conducting what amounts to a surveillance operation on your sister for years before reporting, it's going to look like a vendetta. My heart started racing. It wasn't a vendetta. It was documentation. Sandra closed the folder. The difference between those two things is razor thin, and it's going to come down to how the jury perceives your motivation. If they think you're a concerned professional, we win. If they think you're a vengeful sister, we lose. She stood up. I need you to think very carefully about your testimony, because the defense is going to paint you as obsessed, as someone who engineered this entire situation out of family jealousy. You need to be ready to prove that everything you did was about patient safety, not personal revenge. After she left, I sat alone in my office, the walls feeling like they were closing in. Was that true? Had everything really been about patient safety? Or had I used patient safety as justification for destroying the sister who'd tormented me for 30 years? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at my ceiling, replaying every decision I'd made over the past 3 years. The first time I'd noticed Morgan was working at the hospital and felt a spike of unease. The decision to start keeping a separate file of her activities. The careful documentation of every small irregularity, every suspicious pattern. The choice to wait for evidence to accumulate rather than reporting immediately. The satisfaction I'd felt when Mrs. Donovan's death finally gave me the smoking gun I needed. Marcus was right. Dr. Summers was right. Sandra was right. Somewhere along the way, my justified self-protection had morphed into something darker. I'd become a predator hunting my predator, using patient safety as moral camouflage for revenge. The realization should have devastated me. Instead, I felt oddly liberated, because the truth was, even knowing that, I didn't regret it. Morgan had destroyed too much, hurt too many people, evaded too many consequences. Someone had to stop her, and if my motivations were mixed, so what? The outcome was still justice. The patients were still protected. Morgan was still finally facing accountability. 3 days before trial, I met with Sandra and her team for final preparation. They grilled me for 6 hours, throwing every question the defense might ask, probing for weaknesses in my testimony. Why didn't you report your suspicions immediately? Were you motivated by family grudges? Did you plant evidence? Did you manipulate the situation to make your sister look guilty? I answered each question calmly, sticking to the script we'd developed. I was a concerned professional. I followed proper protocols. I prioritized patient safety. I reported through appropriate channels as soon as I had sufficient evidence. The personal history between Morgan and me was irrelevant to the facts of her crimes. By the end of the session, Sandra looked satisfied. "You'll do fine on the stand. Just remember, you're the hero here. You risked family relationships to protect patients. Don't let them make you into the villain." But as I drove home that evening, I wondered if maybe I was both. Maybe I was the hero who'd protected future patients from a dangerous criminal. And maybe I was the villain who'd cold-bloodedly orchestrated her own sister's destruction, using noble motivations to disguise personal revenge. Maybe those two things could exist simultaneously. The night before jury selection, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called David, Morgan's ex-husband. "David, I need to ask you something honest. Do you think I'm a monster for doing this?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Rebecca, I think you're someone who got tired of being a victim and decided to become a survivor instead. Whether that makes you a monster depends on whether you can live with the methods you chose." I thought about that. Could I live with this? With knowing I'd systematically destroyed my entire family? With the possibility that I'd let patients remain at risk longer than necessary to build an airtight case? With becoming the kind of cold, calculating person I'd always despised? "Yes," I said finally. "I can live with it." Because the alternative was letting Morgan keep hurting people while everyone enabled her. Someone had to stop her, and I was the only one willing to do what was necessary. David's voice was sad when he replied, "Then you're not a monster, Rebecca. You're just someone who learned that justice sometimes requires you to be the villain in someone else's story. Morgan's story will always cast you as the evil sister who destroyed her life. But the truth is, she destroyed her own life, and you were just the one who made sure everyone finally saw it." We hung up after that, and I stood at my windows one last time before the trial began, looking out at the city I'd conquered through sheer determination. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom and finish what I'd started 3 years ago. I would tell my truth, present my evidence, and watch Morgan finally face the consequences she'd evaded for 30 years. And afterward, whether I was labeled hero or villain, I would walk away with my head high, knowing I'd won. Jury selection took 3 days of methodical examination, watching 12 strangers who would decide Morgan's fate get questioned about their ability to be impartial. The defense attorney, a slick corporate type named Robert Hutchins, tried to pack the jury with parents who might sympathize with family loyalty. Sandra countered by filling it with healthcare workers and people who'd lost loved ones to medical negligence. By Thursday afternoon, we had our 12 jurors and 2 alternates, 7 women, 5 men, mostly middle-aged, mostly looking uncomfortable with the weight of what was coming. The trial itself began the following Monday. I sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, watching Morgan get led into the courtroom in her orange jumpsuit, looking thin and pale and nothing like the confident manipulator who'd tormented me for 3 decades. She caught my eye as she sat down, and for a moment, something passed between us, recognition that this was the end game, that one of us would leave this courthouse destroyed. Sandra's opening statement was surgical in its precision. She laid out the timeline of Morgan's crimes with prosecutorial efficiency: the systematic theft of medication over 18 months, the falsification of 47 patient records, the direct causal link between Morgan's actions, and 3 patient deaths, including Mrs. Patricia Donovan. She displayed photographs of the victims, grandmothers, fathers, beloved family members whose lives had been stolen by greed and negligence. She showed the jury medication logs with Morgan's forgeries, security footage of her accessing the medication dispensary at suspicious hours, text messages where she joked about being high at work. By the time Sandra finished, Morgan looked like exactly what she was: a predator who'd worn a medical uniform while hunting vulnerable patients. Robert Hutchins tried to counter with a sob story about addiction being a disease, about Morgan's difficult childhood, about family dysfunction that led her down this path. He painted me as the vindictive sister who'd orchestrated this entire prosecution out of jealousy and spite, suggesting that I'd planted evidence and manipulated records to frame my innocent sister. "The real criminal in this courtroom," he said dramatically, pointing at me, "is sitting right there." The first week of trial was devoted to technical testimony, forensic accountants explaining medication discrepancies, hospital administrators describing protocol violations, digital forensics experts proving the metadata on Morgan's falsified records. I sat through every minute of it, watching the jury's faces shift from neutral to horrified as the magnitude of Morgan's crimes became undeniable. The defense tried to suggest the hospital system was broken, that anyone could have committed these crimes, that there was no direct proof Morgan had been the one responsible. But Sandra had built a case so airtight that every objection fell flat. Week 2 brought the emotional testimony, family members of Morgan's victims describing their loved ones' final days, the confusion when healthy patients suddenly deteriorated, the grief of losing someone who should have recovered. Mrs. Donovan's son testified about watching his mother recover beautifully from routine surgery, talking about her upcoming 75th birthday party, and then suddenly she was seizing, crashing, dying while doctors scrambled to understand why. "We trusted the hospital," he said, his voice breaking. "We trusted them to keep her safe. Instead, they let a drug addict falsify her records and kill her." I watched Morgan throughout that testimony, seeing her mask slip for the first time. She looked genuinely stricken, like maybe she'd never really confronted the human cost of her actions, or maybe she was just a good actress, performing remorse for the jury. I couldn't tell anymore. I'd spent so many years learning to see through her lies that I couldn't recognize truth from her even when it might be real. The defense tried to argue that the medication errors weren't necessarily Morgan's fault, that the records were confusing, that hospital systems had failed these patients in ways beyond one person's control. But Sandra had prepared for this, bringing in expert witnesses who testified that Morgan's specific access codes had been used to alter these specific records during these specific shifts when she'd been the only one present. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Then came my turn on the witness stand. Sandra called me on a Wednesday morning, and I walked to the front of the courtroom feeling every eye on me. The jury, the media, my family in the back rows, and Morgan's hate-filled stare boring into my skull. Sandra started with my professional credentials, establishing me as a respected cardiac surgeon with an impeccable record. Then she moved to my relationship with Morgan, and I described 30 years of manipulation, theft, and lies with clinical detachment. "Did you want to report your sister's crimes?" Sandra asked. "No," I answered honestly. I wanted to believe she was capable of change, that she'd never hurt innocent patients. But the evidence became impossible to ignore. She walked me through the timeline of my documentation, how I'd first noticed irregularities, how I'd reported them through proper channels, how I'd been told to mind my own department, how I'd started keeping my own records because I was concerned about patient safety, how Mrs. Donovan's death had finally triggered a formal complaint because I couldn't stay silent any longer. I testified for 6 hours that day, maintaining perfect composure as Sandra established me as the principled whistleblower who'd sacrificed family relationships for patient safety. Then Thursday morning brought Robert Hutchins's cross-examination, and he came out swinging for blood. "Dr. Hartwell, you've testified that you started documenting your sister's behavior 3 years ago, but the crimes we're prosecuting only go back 18 months. What exactly were you documenting for that first year and a half?" I kept my voice steady. "General concerns about her job performance and reliability." Hutchins smiled like a shark. "Or were you building a case against her, waiting for the perfect opportunity to destroy your sister?" Sandra objected, but the question had landed. "I was concerned about patient safety," I repeated. Hutchins pulled out a document. "This is a text message you sent to a colleague 2 years ago. Quote, 'Morgan is going to hang herself eventually, and I'm going to make sure the rope is strong enough.' That doesn't sound like concern for patient safety, Dr. Hartwell. That sounds like premeditated revenge." My heart stopped. I'd forgotten about that text, sent during a particularly frustrating week when Morgan had gotten away with yet another lie. I was venting frustration about my sister's pattern of avoiding consequences. It wasn't literal. Hutchins moved closer, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Dr. Hartwell, isn't it true that you've been obsessed with your sister for your entire life? That you resented her relationship with your parents, her marriage to your ex-boyfriend, her ability to charm people while you remained cold and distant?" I felt rage flash through me. "That's a mischaracterization of—" "Isn't it true," Hutchins interrupted, "that you've kept detailed files on your sister for years? That you've documented every perceived slight, every family conflict, every moment where you felt overlooked in her favor?" He was twisting everything. making my careful documentation sound like the ravings of an obsessed stalker. I documented a pattern of concerning behavior. You documented a vendetta. Hutchins's voice rose dramatically. You spent years watching your sister, waiting for her to make a mistake big enough that you could finally destroy her. Sandra was objecting. The judge was sustaining, but the damage was done. I could see it in some jurors' faces, doubt creeping in about my motivations. Hutchins spent the rest of Thursday and all of Friday trying to paint me as the real villain, suggesting I'd manipulated evidence, coached witnesses, even implied I might have altered medication records myself to frame Morgan. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand Friday evening, I felt eviscerated, every private pain and motivation dragged into public examination. That weekend was torture. Marcus called once, but we barely spoke. My lawyer assured me I'd done fine, that juries expected aggressive cross-examination. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Hutchins had succeeded in planting reasonable doubt about my motivations, if not my evidence. Monday brought Morgan herself to the stand, and I watched the performance of her lifetime. She cried prettily, describing her struggles with addiction, her troubled relationship with her judgmental older sister, her attempts to get help that were thwarted by a family that didn't understand. She admitted to making mistakes, but insisted she'd never intentionally hurt anyone. My sister has hated me since we were children, Morgan testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She was jealous of my relationship with our parents, with my husband. She's brilliant and successful, but she's never forgiven me for being loved when she felt overlooked. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I watched several jurors soften with sympathy. When I started working at the hospital, Rebecca saw an opportunity. She began watching me constantly, documenting everything I did, waiting for me to slip up. She turned normal workplace mistakes into criminal conspiracies. She twisted my addiction into deliberate murder. Morgan looked directly at the jury, her voice trembling. I'm not perfect. I struggled with pills. I made bad choices, but I never deliberately hurt anyone. My sister, though, she deliberately destroyed our entire family because she couldn't stand that people loved me more than they loved her. Sandra's cross-examination was brutal, but Morgan held firm to her story, crying at all the right moments, showing just enough remorse while maintaining her innocence on the most serious charges. The final week of trial brought closing arguments. Sandra methodically recounted the evidence, the indisputable proof of medication theft, the falsified records with Morgan's access codes, the direct causal link between Morgan's actions and patient deaths. She reminded the jury that this wasn't about family drama or complicated motivations. This was about a healthcare worker who'd stolen drugs, endangered patients, and caused deaths through negligence and greed. Rebecca Hartwell's personal feelings about her sister are irrelevant, Sandra said firmly. What matters is the evidence, and the evidence proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Morgan Hartwell committed these crimes. Robert Hutchins countered with an emotional appeal about addiction, mental illness, family dysfunction, and reasonable doubt about whether Morgan had truly intended to harm anyone. This is a case about two sisters, one brilliant and cold, one troubled but loving. One sister systematically destroyed the other, using her position and power to exact revenge for a lifetime of perceived slights. Don't let Rebecca Hartwell's vendetta result in Morgan Hartwell's wrongful conviction. The jury deliberated for 3 days, 3 days of waiting in agonizing limbo, while 12 strangers debated whether I was a hero or a villain, whether Morgan was a criminal or a victim, whether justice would be served or perverted. I couldn't work, couldn't eat, could barely sleep. Marcus came by once, but we didn't talk about the trial, didn't talk about us, just sat in uncomfortable silence until he left. Finally, Thursday afternoon, the call came. The jury had reached a verdict. I walked into that courtroom with my spine straight and my face expressionless, refusing to show the terror thrumming through my veins. Morgan sat at the defense table looking small and scared, our parents behind her holding hands and glaring at me with pure hatred. The jury filed in, and I searched their faces for any hint of what was coming. The foreperson stood, an older woman who'd been a nurse for 30 years, and I felt a tiny spark of hope. The judge asked for the verdict on the first count, theft of controlled substances. Guilty. Morgan gasped, grabbing her lawyer's arm. The judge continued through the counts: medication theft, guilty; record falsification, guilty; patient endangerment, guilty. With each guilty, Morgan's composure cracked further until she was openly sobbing. Then came the counts I'd been waiting for, the ones that mattered most: involuntary manslaughter in the death of Patricia Donovan, guilty; second-degree murder through depraved indifference in 2 other patient deaths, guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. On every single count, all 47 charges, the jury had found her guilty. The courtroom erupted. My mother screamed. My father shouted something at me that the judge immediately gavelled down. Morgan collapsed at the defense table, her lawyer trying to hold her upright while she wailed about her daughter, her life, how this wasn't fair. I sat perfectly still, feeling nothing but cold, complete satisfaction. I had won. Utterly, totally, irrevocably won. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare impact statements and arguments. As I left the courthouse that day, reporters swarmed me with cameras and questions. "Dr. Hartwell, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you have any sympathy for your sister? Do you regret reporting her?" I gave them nothing, pushing through to my car with my lawyer running interference. But once I was alone, driving through Seattle's streets toward my empty apartment, something unexpected happened. I started crying. Not tears of joy or relief, but something messier and more complicated. I'd won, but the victory felt hollow in ways I hadn't anticipated. Morgan was destroyed, yes, but so was everything else. My family was fractured beyond repair. My relationship with Marcus was probably over. I'd become exactly the kind of cold, calculating person I'd always despised. I'd achieved perfect revenge, and it tasted like ashes. That night, alone in my apartment, I received a call from David. "I watched the verdict on the news," he said quietly. "How are you holding up?" I surprised myself by answering honestly. "I don't know. I got everything I wanted, but I feel empty." David was quiet for a moment. "That's what revenge does, Rebecca. It doesn't actually heal anything. It just creates a different kind of pain." I wanted to argue, to insist this was justice, not revenge, but I was too tired for lies. Did I do the right thing? The question escaped before I could stop it. "You did what you thought was necessary," David replied carefully. "Whether it was right, I think that's something only you can answer. But Rebecca, for what it's worth, I think you saved lives. Whatever your motivations, you stopped Morgan from hurting more patients. That matters." After we hung up, I poured myself a scotch and stood at my windows, looking out at the city I'd conquered, and wondered if saving lives by destroying my sister made me a hero or just a different kind of monster. The answer, I realized, was probably both. Sentencing day arrived 2 weeks later under gray Seattle skies that matched my mood. I'd barely slept the night before, kept awake by dreams of Morgan's face when the guilty verdicts had been read. That mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and pure hatred that I couldn't unsee. But I dressed carefully in a black suit, pulled my hair into a severe bun, and drove to the courthouse with my shoulders back and my expression neutral. This was the final act, and I would see it through without wavering. The gallery was packed when I arrived. Mrs. Donovan's family sat in the front rows on the prosecution side. My parents sat behind the defense table, looking like they'd aged 20 years in 2 weeks. I took my seat near Sandra and her team, ignoring the hostile stares burning into my back. The judge entered, and Morgan was brought in wearing the same orange jumpsuit, but looking fundamentally broken in a way I'd never seen before. Her hair was lank and unwashed, her face puffy from crying, her eyes hollow. When she glanced my way, there was no fight left in her, just a kind of desperate animal fear. The judge began by inviting victim impact statements. Mrs. Donovan's son stood first, his voice shaking as he described losing his mother. The pain of learning she'd died not from medical complications but from criminal negligence. "Morgan Hartwell stole my mother's last years," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She stole our goodbyes, our last Christmas together. my children's memories of their grandmother, for pills, for a high. 2 other families spoke, sharing similar stories of loss and betrayal. By the time they finished, even Robert Hutchins looked defeated. Then the judge asked if Morgan wanted to address the court before sentencing. She stood slowly, her legs shaking, and turned to face the gallery. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry to the families I hurt. I never meant for anyone to die. I was sick. I was addicted. Her voice broke. "I was weak." She turned to look at our parents. "I'm sorry I let you down. I'm sorry I wasted every chance you gave me." Then her eyes found mine and her expression hardened. "But I'm not sorry to you, Rebecca. You did this. You watched me struggle for years and never tried to help me. You waited until you could destroy me completely. You're not a hero. You're just cruel." The judge gavelled down the outburst, but Morgan kept talking, her voice rising hysterically. "You win, okay? You finally win. You're the successful one, the perfect daughter, the one everyone will praise while I rot in prison. I hope it was worth sacrificing your own sister." The bailiffs restrained her as she started to lunge toward me, and the judge called a brief recess while Morgan was removed to calm down. In the hallway, my mother cornered me with wild eyes. "Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted?" I looked at this woman who'd given birth to me but never really been my mother, and felt nothing. "What I wanted was for you to love me as much as you loved her. What I got was everything I needed to finally stop caring." She slapped me. Hard enough to snap my head sideways. Hard enough to leave a mark. Security immediately intervened, pulling her away as she screamed about how I'd destroyed her baby, ruined her family, broken her heart. I touched my burning cheek and walked back into the courtroom without looking back. When proceedings resumed, the judge delivered Morgan's sentence with cold precision. "Ms. Hartwell, you have been convicted of 47 counts involving theft, fraud, and the deaths of 3 patients. Your actions represent a profound betrayal of trust and a callous disregard for human life." Morgan was sobbing quietly, her lawyer's hand on her shoulder. "While I recognize that addiction is a disease, your choices to steal medication, falsify records, and continue working while impaired demonstrate a level of culpability that cannot be excused. You had numerous opportunities to seek help, to stop, to do the right thing. Instead, you chose to protect yourself at the cost of innocent lives." The judge looked down at her notes. "On the theft charges, you are sentenced to 5 years per count, to run concurrently. On the falsification charges, 10 years per count, to run consecutively with the theft sentences. On the manslaughter and murder charges, you are sentenced to 25 years to life on each count, to run consecutively." The numbers added up to something staggering. Morgan would serve a minimum of 93 years before being eligible for parole. She would die in prison. She would never see her daughter graduate high school, never attend her wedding, never meet her grandchildren. She would spend the rest of her life in a cell, and she would do it knowing I had put her there. Morgan's wail of anguish echoed through the courtroom as the reality sank in. My mother fainted. My father was shouting something I couldn't hear over the chaos, but I sat perfectly still, watching my sister being led away in chains, screaming my name and cursing me with her last moments of freedom. And I felt nothing but cold, complete satisfaction. Sandra squeezed my shoulder as we left the courthouse. "You did the right thing, Dr. Hartwell. You saved lives today." I nodded, accepting the praise mechanically, but my mind was already moving forward to what came next. The civil suits would proceed. Morgan had no assets, but the hospital would settle with the families for millions. My own defamation suit against my parents would continue, bankrupting them completely as legal fees consumed what little they had left. Morgan's daughter would grow up knowing her mother was a convicted murderer, and I'd made sure David had full custody and resources to give Emma a better life than Morgan ever could have provided. 3 months after sentencing, I received a letter from Morgan in prison. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single page in her handwriting, still familiar despite everything. "Rebecca, I've had a lot of time to think in here, about what I did, about who I became, about how we ended up here. You were right about me. I was a monster. I hurt people. I killed people. I deserve to be here. But you were a monster too. You watched me destroy myself and did nothing until you could use it against me. You let patients die so your case would be stronger. You're just better at hiding behind righteousness than I was. We're the same, you and me. We're both willing to destroy anything to get what we want. The only difference is, you're still free to pretend you're the hero. I hope you enjoy your victory. I hope it keeps you warm at night when you're alone, because no one can stand to be close to something as cold as you've become. We're both in prison now. Mine just has bars. Morgan. I read the letter 3 times, examining each accusation for truth. Was she right? Had I let patients remain at risk longer than necessary to build my case? Had I become a monster in my quest to stop one? I thought about Marcus, who'd stopped calling after the trial. About Dr. Summers, my therapist, who'd looked at me with something like pity during our last session. About the hollow victory I felt every time someone praised me for my courage. Then I burned the letter in my fireplace, watching Morgan's words turn to ash, and poured myself a scotch. Whether she was right didn't matter anymore. It was done. Justice, or revenge, or whatever we wanted to call it, had been served. 6 months after sentencing, I was featured in a medical journal article about healthcare whistleblowers. A year later, I gave the keynote speech at a patient safety conference. 18 months later, I published a book about my experience that became a bestseller, with all proceeds going to patient advocacy organizations. The world saw me as a hero who'd sacrificed family for principles, but I knew the truth that Morgan had seen clearly from her prison cell. I'd become exactly what I'd needed to become to destroy her. Cold, calculating, willing to sacrifice anything to achieve my goal. I'd won the war but lost something essential in the process: the ability to trust, the capacity for warmth, the belief that relationships mattered more than vindication. I lived in my beautiful apartment with my successful career and my pristine reputation, and I was utterly, completely alone. Marcus had married someone else, a public defender with a warm laugh and no shadows in her past. My colleagues respected me but kept their distance, sensing the ice beneath my professional courtesy. My family was shattered beyond repair, and I had no desire to rebuild it. But here's the thing about winning at all costs. You do win. Morgan rotted in prison, exactly as she deserved. My parents lost everything, exactly as they'd earned. Emma grew up with her father, safe from Morgan's influence. Future patients were protected by the stricter protocols my case had inspired. I saved lives by destroying my sister, and I'd do it again without hesitation. 3 years after the trial, I received notice that my mother had died, a heart attack brought on by stress and grief over her imprisoned daughter. The funeral was invitation only, and I wasn't invited. I sent flowers anyway, expensive ones, with a card that read simply, Rebecca. My father returned them with a note. You killed her as surely as Morgan killed Mrs. Donovan. Stay away from us. I kept the note in a drawer, one more piece of evidence that I'd won completely. 5 years after sentencing, I was promoted to chief of cardiac surgery at Seattle Presbyterian, the youngest person ever to hold the position. At my celebration dinner, surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed. Really laughed. Not the professional chuckle I'd perfected for networking events. Couldn't remember the last time I'd let someone close enough to see behind the armor I'd built. Couldn't remember what it felt like to be vulnerable or soft or anything other than vigilantly triumphant. But I had what I'd always wanted: respect, success, recognition that I was valuable and important. Nobody excluded me from anything anymore. Nobody chose Morgan over me. Nobody dismissed my concerns or gaslit me about her crimes. I'd burned down the entire toxic system that had oppressed me, and I stood in the ashes wearing a crown of thorns and calling it victory. And the truth? I'd do it all again. Every cold calculation, every documented piece of evidence, every moment I'd waited while patients remained at risk so my case would be bulletproof, every relationship I'd sacrificed, every line I'd crossed. Because Morgan deserved to rot in prison, and I deserved to be free of her shadow. Whether that made me a hero or a monster didn't matter anymore. I'd won, and winning was its own justification. 7 years after the trial, I attended a medical conference in Chicago where they presented me with a Lifetime Achievement Award for patient safety advocacy. Standing at that podium, accepting applause from hundreds of healthcare professionals, I caught my reflection in the ballroom's mirrors. I looked exactly like what I'd become: polished, professional, perfect, and completely untouchable. Morgan had been right in her letter from prison. We were both in cages now. Mine just had better furniture. But as I held that award and smiled for photographs, I felt no regret for the choices I'd made. Morgan destroyed herself. I just made sure everyone finally saw the destruction clearly. And if I'd become something cold and calculating in the process, well, that was simply the price of refusing to be a victim anymore. Some people might call that tragic. I called it survival, and I called it winning.